Paris, 1440. The fog rolls heavy over the stone bridges of Nantes as the crowd gathers, silent, unmoving, breathless. On the scaffold, a man ascends step by step. His hands are bound, but his spine remains unbent. Not long ago, this man was France's pride, a noble of staggering wealth, a war hero who rode beside Joan of Arc in the bloodiest days of the 100 Years' War. His name, Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France. But today, no one claps, no one cheers. Because today, that same man is condemned as the monster of the Middle Ages. He is accused of slaughtering children, hundreds of them, of offering their blood to demons in grotesque rituals, of selling his soul in a desperate bid to regain lost riches and resurrect shattered glory. But what if it's a lie? What if this monstrous narrative, the rooms of horror, the black mass, the screams in the cellar, was all a script written by those who coveted his lands, envied his power, and feared what he represented? What if the real crime was not what he did, but what he knew? This is not just a story of a man's fall from grace. It's a story of how history punishes those who no longer serve its agenda. Because in a kingdom bleeding from war, where the church reasserts its grip and the dukes circle like vultures, a hero who turns inward becomes dangerous. A legend who stops fighting becomes vulnerable. And a noble who once stood beside a living saint becomes disposable. The trial of Gilles de Rais wasn't just about bodies, it was about land, reputation, silence, and rewriting the legacy of a man who had already reshaped the fate of a nation once. So ask yourself, is this the tale of a sadistic killer or the most orchestrated character assassination in medieval Europe? Gilles de Rais was not born a monster. He was born into opulence, into blue blood, into a world where power was inherited, not earned, and where affection was often the first casualty of privilege. It was September 1405, and the chateaux of Brittany echoed with celebration. The birth of Gilles, heir to the illustrious house of Montmorency-Laval, meant the continuation of one of France's oldest and richest bloodlines. His father, Guy de Laval, had titles stretching across the region. His mother, Marie de Craon, was descended from one of the most ruthless and politically savvy noble families of the age. But before Gilles could grow into the shoes laid out for him, fate snatched away the very foundation of his world. By the age of 11, both his parents were dead. His father, some whispered, fell in a suspicious riding accident. His mother faded quickly after, some say from illness, others from grief. What's undeniable is that Gilles was left in the iron grip of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man both revered and feared. Jean de Craon didn't believe in raising boys. He believed in molding weapons. Cold, calculating, brutally pragmatic. He had clawed his way up Brittany's feudal hierarchy through cunning marriages, backroom deals, and an absolute lack of sentimentality. Now, with his grandson in tow, he saw opportunity, a child with the right bloodline, a massive inheritance, and no one left to protect him. Under Craon's guardianship, Gilles' life was stripped of warmth. Education wasn't about learning, it was about weaponizing. Combat training, court etiquette, and theology were drilled into him, not as knowledge but as currency for power. Emotions were dismissed as weakness, and morality, that was for peasants. By 15, Gilles was not a boy, but a pawn. Craon orchestrated a marriage between Gilles and Catherine de Tours, a wealthy heiress whose estates would stretch the family's influence even deeper into Brittany and Poitou. The union gave Gilles an empire of land, 15 castles, thousands of hectares, and revenues that rivaled the king's own coffers. On paper, it was a triumph. In practice, it was another link in the chain of control. Gilles had wealth, status, lineage, but he had no compass, no affection, no vision that was truly his own. And that is where the tragedy begins. Because a boy who grows up without affection often learns to crave validation in dangerous ways. A boy raised to view people as assets and leverage may one day see no difference between a child and a coin. At court, Gilles was admired, young, dashing, unnervingly intelligent. But those who got too close often noted something strange, an intensity in his eyes that bordered on feverish, a theatricality in his speech, and a chilling detachment when others spoke of sorrow, death, or loss. Was it trauma, a defense mechanism, or the first symptoms of something darker? One tutor would later describe him as a brilliant flame, burning without center. Another wrote cryptically that Gilles understood the Mass better than most bishops, but not a single word of Christ. It's a sentence that would haunt his legacy. Because when you teach a child to master ritual but not redemption, when you give him castles but no conscience, when you strip away every softness and replace it with steel, you do not raise a man, you forge a weapon. And like all weapons, eventually it must be aimed. Some say monsters are born, but what if the real horror is this? Gilles de Rais became everything his grandfather ever wanted, and it destroyed him. And as France bled under the weight of the 100 Years' War, the weapon that was Gilles de Rais would soon find its first cause. A girl, a vision, a battlefield, and a destiny no one could have foreseen. Because next, Gilles would meet Joan of Arc, and the boy without a soul would finally find something to believe in. But as history often warns, belief can be just as dangerous as blood. By 1427, the kingdom was a shadow of itself. The 100 Years' War had left its soil soaked in blood, its people broken, and its king, a timid Charles VII, reduced to ruling a sliver of territory. The English occupied vast regions. The Burgundians, traitorous allies of the enemy, controlled the rest. Chaos reigned, and the nobility whispered that perhaps God had turned his back on France. And then she arrived. Joan, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy, claiming visions from God, visions of saints, visions of victory, visions of salvation. The court laughed. The clergy called her delusional. The generals scoffed, but not Gilles de Rais. No one could explain it, but something in her presence, perhaps her absolute conviction, her unshakable innocence, her fury and faith, cut through Gilles like thunder. He didn't just believe her, he followed her. While older knights hesitated, Gilles offered his men, his arms, his gold. He became her sword-bearer, her protector, her battlefield companion. And on those blood-soaked fields, Orléans, Jargeau, Patay, they fought as one, the orphan weapon of Brittany and the virgin prophet of God. Their victories were not just military, they were spiritual. Joan rekindled the soul of a nation, and Gilles, for the first time, seemed to glimpse a life with purpose. Not conquest, not gold, but meaning. In 1429, after their relentless campaign, Gilles stood beside her as Charles VII was crowned king in Reims. That same year, Gilles was anointed Marshal of France. At just 25, he had become one of the youngest, most decorated commanders in the realm. But accolades meant nothing to him anymore. What mattered, what seemed to hold him together, was Joan. And that would be his undoing. Because less than 2 years later, she was gone. Captured, condemned, burned alive as a heretic on a public pyre in Rouen. Gilles could do nothing, or perhaps he did nothing. History is unclear. But something inside him broke that day, permanently. They say he never screamed during battle, but when Joan burned, those who were near say he wept like a child. And as her ashes blew into the wind, Gilles de Rais, the man France once called his lion, turned away from God, from war, and from the light. What came next would stain history forever. Joan of Arc's death was not just a political tragedy. For Gilles de Rais, it was a cosmic rupture. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake, not by English swords or enemy arrows, but by cowardice wrapped in cassocks, sanctioned by the very church that had once blessed her sword. Gilles wasn't at Rouen that day, but it didn't matter. The flames that consumed her body also consumed what remained of his soul. He withdrew, quietly, completely. No more glory, no more campaigns. The Marshal of France vanished into his Breton estates, leaving behind the courts and councils where his voice once commanded fear and awe. What emerged in his place was a man haunted, hungry, and hollowed out. Gilles threw himself into creation, not of empire but of illusion. He began to fund grand theatrical productions across his territories. elaborate religious mystery plays, most centered on themes of redemption, martyrdom, and sacrifice. Joan's likeness, thinly veiled, appeared again and again. Some whispered he was trying to resurrect her in art. Others said he was trying to rewrite the ending she never deserved. He poured fortunes into building chapels of impossible luxury. He hired choirs of young boys with angelic voices, commissioning composers to craft hymns for a woman the church had branded a witch. The cost? Enough to sustain an army. And when the gold ran out, he didn't stop. One by one, the castles he inherited were mortgaged or sold. Servants went unpaid, lenders circled, and still the curtain rose night after night to ever-diminishing applause. This wasn't mere grief. This was a man drowning in ritual, mistaking grandeur for absolution. And then he met Francesco Prelati, a young cleric from Florence, charming, erudite, and entirely untrustworthy. Prelati claimed to possess secret knowledge from the East: alchemy, necromancy, communication with spirits. He promised Gilles he could transmute metals into gold, resurrect fortune, restore power. But the rituals would require more than lead and fire. They needed blood. They needed sacrifice. And Gilles, once a boy without guidance, once a man who watched a saint die in flames, agreed. He who once burned churches to defend a prophet now lit candles to summon demons. Prelati's ceremonies began in secret, hidden chambers, Latin incantations, drawings etched into stone floors. Sometimes Gilles watched, sometimes he led, and sometimes, according to whispered confessions later torn out under torture, he offered more than just medals. Children. The first disappearances would come soon after. But at this point, nobody noticed. Not yet. Because monsters in real life don't appear all at once. They arrive in layers. And Gilles de Rais was only just beginning to shed his skin. It began as whispers, barely audible, barely believable. In the villages surrounding Gilles de Rais' crumbling estates, mothers clutched their children tighter at dusk. Boys, always boys, aged 7 to 16, were vanishing. No witnesses, no bodies, no answers. Just silence, punctuated by screams no one dared confirm. At first, no one connected the dots. These were peasant children, after all, stray laborers, orphans. In a France ravaged by war and plague, a missing child was a tragedy, but not an outrage. Not yet, but the rumors spread like smoke. Castle servants began to whisper about strange visitors, lavish feasts with no guests, and locked rooms that echoed at night. Some claimed they heard chanting in unknown tongues. Others swore they saw flames flickering beneath the stones, light coming from cellars that should have been dark. Still, Gilles remained untouchable. He was a marshal of France, a war hero, a noble whose shadow still carried the myth of Joan of Arc. Even as he sold off properties and descended deeper into occult obsession, no one dared challenge him, until he made one fatal mistake. In May 1440, during a dispute over a small parcel of church land, Gilles abducted a cleric named Jean Le Ferron. This wasn't a child, this was a man of the cloth. And in a kingdom still under the grip of the Catholic Church, attacking the church was suicide. The response was immediate. John V, Duke of Brittany, long suspicious, long hungry for Gilles' remaining lands, seized the moment. He ordered an investigation, not just into the abduction, but into the dark cloud of rumors that had followed Gilles for nearly a decade. Ducal officers raided Château de Machecoul, Gilles' primary residence. What they found turned whispers into screams. In the underground chambers, investigators uncovered a gallery of horrors: bones blackened with ash, scorched remnants of children's clothing, blood-stained tables, and stone walls engraved with esoteric symbols. Hidden rooms bore the smell of old smoke and rot. In the corners, small toys, a wooden horse, a child's shoe. The myth had become matter. Gilles de Rais was arrested. So were his close servants, Etienne Corriot, Henriet, and the cleric Prelati. Under interrogation, and in many cases, under torture, they confessed to everything. They described how Gilles lured boys with promises of food or employment, how once inside the castle, they were stripped, tied, and murdered, sometimes swiftly, sometimes not. Some accounts describe rituals, sexual sadism, and even necromancy. And Gilles himself? At first he denied it all, claimed it was slander from rivals, that only the king could try a marshal of France. But when the church threatened him with excommunication, when the gallows loomed over his legacy, he broke. He confessed, publicly, in gruesome detail. He admitted to the murders, to the dark magic, to calling on demons in desperate attempts to restore his lost fortune. The Marshal of France, protector of Joan of Arc, once prayed to angels, now begged demons for gold, while the bones of children cooled beneath his feet. The confession was a wildfire. Parish bells rang with fury. Mothers wept. Nobles recoiled. The very image of France's past glory had become its greatest shame. And yet, even as his crimes stunned the nation, a deeper, more disturbing question began to surface among a few scholars and observers. Or had fear, politics, and torture crafted a myth more monstrous than the man himself? That question would burn long after Gilles' body hung limp from the rope. By the time Gilles de Rais stood trial in October 1440, the public had already decided his fate. The gallows were ready, the sermons were written, and France, still scarred by war, still hungry for purification, was eager to see a devil hanged. The trial, held in Nantes, played out more like theater than justice. Gilles sat surrounded by clergy, nobles, and judges, his title meaningless now, his past deeds buried beneath an avalanche of accusations. Witnesses came forward, dozens, servants, townspeople, even former accomplices. They described horrors beyond imagination. Young boys strangled with towels, bled on altars, their remains burned in secret furnaces. Some accounts claimed Gilles laughed during the killings. Others said he wept. All of it fed the fire. But beneath the spectacle, a more cynical plot pulsed just beneath the surface. The Duke of Brittany, John V, stood to gain everything from Gilles' conviction: his lands, his castles, his power. The church, still bruised by its role in Joan of Arc's execution, needed a new villain to cleanse its conscience. And Charles VII, newly secure on his throne, had no interest in defending a former hero who had become a liability. And so, the confession. Yes, Gilles de Rais admitted to the murders, to invoking demons, to committing acts so vile they defy even medieval comprehension. But he did so after the church threatened him with excommunication, a spiritual death for a man raised to fear nothing more than damnation. His accomplices, tortured into agreement, their testimonies soaked in pain, their stories eerily identical, as if rehearsed. Even the evidence, the bones, the ashes, though real, were never forensically connected to specific crimes. Could they have been planted, misinterpreted, or were they simply tragic coincidences used to confirm a narrative already in motion? When a man confesses to being a demon, ask yourself, is he evil, or has he finally told a story his enemies have waited to hear? In modern courts, the case would collapse. The use of torture, the lack of cross-examination, the political motivations, all fatal flaws. But this was 15th century France. And in 15th century France, the truth was, whatever power needed it to be. Gilles was sentenced to death. On October 26, 1440, he was hanged and burned before thousands. Before the flames consumed his body, he gave a final speech, begging forgiveness, warning others of dark arts, urging parents to protect their children. But no repentance could redeem his legacy, not then. And yet the questions never stopped. Was Gilles de Rais a sadistic killer, corrupted by grief and the occult? Or was he a sacrificial scapegoat, destroyed to protect a church in crisis and feed a state rebuilding its mythos? Because when a hero falls, the world needs to believe he deserved it. And that might be the most terrifying truth of all. October 26, 1440, the man who once rode beside Joan of Arc, who had stormed the gates of Orléans, who was once toasted in royal courts as France's golden warrior, now dangled lifeless from a rope, flames licking the edges of his legacy. To the crowd in Nantes, it was justice. To the church, it was cleansing. To the state, it was closure. But history rarely settles so neatly. In the centuries that followed, Gilles de Rais became more than a criminal. He became a legend. His name merged with folklore, most famously inspiring the terrifying tale of Bluebeard, a nobleman who lured and murdered young women in secret chambers. The lines between historical record and myth blurred, perhaps intentionally. Modern historians have pulled at the seams of his case. They found contradictions in testimonies, inconsistencies in dates, absurd exaggerations in the number of victims, motives behind the prosecution that align too perfectly with the ambitions of his enemies. And the confessions, wrung from men under torture, now raise more questions than they ever answered. They argue that the trial was not about justice, but about erasure. Erasing a man who no longer served the interests of crown or church. A man who had once held too much land, too much loyalty, too much power. A man who could rally armies and believed in saints. A man who, in their eyes, needed to disappear. And yet, there are those who insist the crimes were real, that his descent into ritual and horror fits the psychological profile of a man torn apart by trauma, guilt, and desperation. That beneath the politics and theater, there was indeed a predator hiding behind the mask of a patriot. So which is it? Was Gilles de Rais the Middle Ages' most monstrous child killer? Or was he a victim of a machine designed to consume its own heroes the moment they outlived their use? Perhaps we'll never know. But what remains, 5 centuries later, is a story that refuses to die. A life that forces us to ask where truth ends and propaganda begins. And a legacy that reminds us, in times of chaos, power writes the script, and someone always plays the villain. Who do you believe? And more importantly, why?